I'm Diana Loring, Director of the Department of the Interior's Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to our latest installment of our public lecture series. As many of you know, these presentations tend to encompass a wide range of topics that reflect the diverse workings of our bureaus and the Department of the Interior as a whole, both past and present. And today's program is a discussion on how paleontological resources are managed and a strategic management tool that's being used in the field both nationally and with our international partners. Before we get started, I want to point out that you all have on your seats feedback forms. We encourage you to fill these out and deposit them in the tray that's just outside at the conclusion of the lecture. We greatly appreciate all of your input, and many of our programs do come from our visitors telling us what they want to learn more about, or giving us suggestions on different workings in the department that they think would be of specific interest to others. In terms of coming up lectures, on Wednesday, July 17th, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service biologist Dr. Dolores Savagnano will be here to talk about why pollinators are so beneficial to your garden and share some resources that could be useful to gardeners. August 7th, Alan O'Connell from the U.S. Geological Survey Patuxent Wildlife Research Center will present on the whooping crane breeding program. But turning our attention to today's presenter, Senior Paleontologist Dr. Scott Foss has been with the Bureau of Land Management for nearly 14 years. Prior to that, he spent 13 years as a museum curator and paleontologist with the National Park Service. So congratulations, you're coming up on almost 30 years of service. Oh, we've got a few more years until that happens, but yeah, so being able to speak to the breadth of not only BLM but National Park Service as well in paleontology. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Scott Foss.
Well, thank you, Diana. So yes, I'm Scott Foss. I'm the paleontologist, senior paleontologist for the Bureau of Land Management, and I started with the federal government on May 14th, 1992, which was the day that the Tyrannosaurus Sioux was confiscated in South Dakota. So my career follows kind of the topic of today's talk. Interesting how that is. So following along those same lines, after the Tyrannosaur I was in South Dakota that day. I was working at Badlands National Park, and I was going to be a professor of paleontology, and that day kind of steered me toward what I consider myself now as the paleocrat. I've worked for the federal government ever since then. So one thing we've learned is in the management of paleontological resources, and I realize that this is kind of a large topic and you could apply it to other things, other subjects, but my subject is paleontology, so we're going to stay on paleontology, but it doesn't escape my awareness that this could apply to many other topics. And so when we talk about managing paleontology, and of course my job is in the Department of Interior, specifically with the Bureau of Land Management, but thinking on a larger scale, the principles to managing paleontological resources really can apply everywhere if you take a certain approach to it. And that's the approach I'm trying to put on now, is a very large scale, 30,000 foot approach to what does it take to manage these resources. And I've boiled it down to what I call the Paleontology MAP, MAP, which is mission, authority, and program. That simple. Really, really easy. And so when we talk about the mission is really the real purpose for managing these resources. Why are we going to do it? And it is shocking how many times we don't ask ourselves that question when we go into it, is what is it we're really going to try and do here? What do we want to do? And I'll give some case studies at the end of the talk, but I'll hint to what's coming here. The reasons that we manage paleontological resources are not always the same wherever we go. So for instance, In 1999, the Bureaus of Department of Interior and Department of Agriculture and the Smithsonian were requested to put together a report to Congress. And the report to Congress was signed under the Department of Interior, the Secretary Babbitt at the time. So it's the Secretary of Interior's report to Congress of 2000, Secretary Babbitt. But it was actually assembled by the Smithsonian, the Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Interior. What's important about that is that it really stressed that there was more to paleontology management than just protection, because everything we had heard up until that point was we need to protect these fossils. People are stealing them, we have to protect them. Well, why do we want to protect them? Well, so people won't steal them. It becomes this circular logic, and until that point, at least on a management point of view, we hadn't stepped back and said, well, why are we doing this to begin with? What is the purpose of this? And they said, well, there's scientific research, it's really important, everyone knows that. Well, no, the scientists know that, but I'm not sure that the Department of Interior knows that, or that the Department of Agriculture knows that. We hadn't articulated it until that point. So that becomes very important, and it's really important on the mission to talk about why we're doing this, what we're going to do. And then number two comes into our authorities. Okay, you want to protect paleontological resources. What laws are there that are already doing that? What is it going to be? Now, in 2009, the Paleontological Resources Preservation Act was passed as part of the Omnibus Public Lands Management Act of 2009, and it was subtitled D, Paleontological Resources Preservation. It wasn't touted. I mean, there were a lot of laws in that act, in the Omnibus Act. And paleontology really didn't float to the surface. In fact, even the Secretary of Interior at the time didn't even recognize paleontological resource management as part of that act. It was kind of just, there were so many other things that were happening in that act. We noticed. We noticed definitely. It was very important. And that act really followed a lot of the recommendations that came out in 1999. So over 10 years, these recommendations had made their way into a law. And 10 years from a report to Congress to actually a law. These become our authorities, at least here in the United States, for managing paleontological resources. And what's important about that is that these authorities aren't centered on just protection. And in other countries right now, we're going to see this, it's about we need to protect these resources, they're getting stolen. And it's like, step back, why do we want to protect them? Why would we do that? And so when we start asking these questions, and this really helped me to think about this, is when I've been approached by colleagues from other countries who say, well, we have this problem, or we have that problem, we have that problem. I'm like, time out. You can't take our manual and apply it where you are. You have different authorities, different laws that govern what you do. It doesn't work that way. So that's really caused us to drill deep into what's going on in all these different countries. But what is common to all these, every management program is what I call the program, the P in the map is the program. And that is the how are you going to do it. You have a mission of what you'd like to accomplish, and you have the authorities of what you can do. And so here in Department of Interior, we have the Paleontological Resources Preservation Act. The Bureau of Land Management has Federal Land Policy Management Act, which does apply to the management of paleontology. The National Park Service has their Organic Act of 1916, very specific what it does, and it applies definitely to paleontology. And there's many, many other acts that apply to paleontology in one way or another. So we have to pull those together, see that they all are consistent with each other, and see how they apply to paleontology. But then comes the part of what are we going to do about it, and that's the program. And so the program I've boiled down to 8 couplets, so it's easy to remember. There are 8 parts to the program, or I like the 4 couplets, because they seem to complement one another. And so for number 1 is inventory and monitoring. And it is when you start a program, especially if you're managing resources out on public lands, before, and again, what did we tell Congress we needed? We need to protect these fossils. We're not going to protect them yet. You know what we're going to do first? We're going to find out what we have. We can't protect it if we don't know it exists, if we don't know what it is. Inventory is so critical, and yet our research colleagues are out there. We want to find it and we want to collect it. Well, slow down. Let's find out what we have first. Let's get the big picture. Inventory is so important. And what is inventory without monitoring? And so that is where the second half of the couplet is. First, you have a program of inventory, then you have a program of monitoring. And really, I mean, what good is it inventorying what you have if you just give up and say, okay, we're done, we know what we have? Well, you have to monitor, make sure you still have that. Make sure that you have a full understanding of what those resources are. So inventory and monitoring. And we find in many programs we just use inventory and monitoring as a single idea. In larger programs, no, they're very separate things. In our case, the inventory is being done by our permittees. We're not doing inventory. BLM has 7 paleontologists, and we're not out there inventorying. There's 7 of us in the entire country, and we're doing well because Forest Service has 2. So they're not out there inventorying either. So who is doing this inventory for us? Our permittees. And we have lots of professional permittees out there doing this, which means we need them to report back to us. It also means we need to kind of read those reports. Otherwise, what good is it? But this is how we are accomplishing it right now. So a program of inventory, a program of monitoring. Then we get to the next part of this is we have to do some planning. And this is something I have a whole different talk under the guise of ethics in the field ethics and ethics in paleontology that really talks about planning. And planning is a big part of planning is a question of ethics, and that has to do with value. I mean, the first question in ethics is values. What are the values on the land? What do we find important out there? Because if you ask 20 paleontologists what's important, they'll all tell you that the fossils are what's important out there. You know, that's why we're managing the land, right, for these important fossils. But as soon as you get beyond that, you find out that some people think mountain biking is more important than fossils. And believe it or not, there are people who think hunting is important. And there are people who think that the land is really cool because we should just, preserve wildlife and habitat for things. And there's a lot of value to extraction, oil and gas, coal, oil. That's what we find valuable on the land. And so these are all the different values on the land. And so we get to planning, and of course, most of us are professional planners for a living, so I don't want to belabor planning too much. But planning is critical to what we do because it's the process of evaluating all of the values, not just the paleontology. It's understanding everything that's out there. And then the second side of the coin to planning is mitigation. And planning might be, the Park Service has an easy time of planning because the planning is, we're an organization that is all about preservation, and we find fossils and we're going to preserve them. Mitigation doesn't become as big a big a face in Park Service as it would for BLM, where we're not going out there to find what we can find to preserve it. We're going out there to find what we can find to inventory it before we run a bulldozer through there, or a right-of-way, or an energy transmission. And so we have to have what we call mitigation, and there are various options of what we can do. There's really 3 options. You can avoid it, you can collect it, or you can bulldoze it, or every variation in between. But planning helps us assign these values, recognize these values, and decide how we're going to do what it is we're doing. And then mitigation is what we are going to do about that. And mitigation is super, super important, for instance, for BLM, because it's big enough that it gets its own slide. But in this case here, and this is a photo here, the color red on there is very rich fossil resources, and this is off a geologic map in southern Utah, or central Utah. And so the lighter colors are not very likely to find paleontological resources, and as you get deeper red, you get to the higher probability of finding paleontological resources. We call this the potential fossil yield classification, and what we do is we simply just apply a number 1 to 5 on geologic maps to the state. It's a fairly simple concept. There's no actual fossils on the map, so we can share this with the public. It's easy to see, and it's a great planning tool. And then you drop on that, and the dropped on there are oil oil and gas leases, proposed oil and gas leases. So those proposed oil and gas leases, there's a big cluster in the lower center there. Not a lot of known or not a lot of potential to hit paleontological resources in those. But look at the ones up in the upper portion there to the left. That's very high potential to find paleontological resources. So there is a lot of information in this map right here, and this is useful in planning. This is a planning tool. So when it comes to the lease sales, we're going to say in those deep red areas, be ready, you might have to deal with some mitigation for paleontology. There might be some costs involved with that. There's some considerations there versus some of the ones further south, less consideration for paleontology. I mean, and this we can do. Remember, there's only 7 of us in the Bureau. And how many lease parcels are there here? There's a couple hundred just right here. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of these across the Bureau. We can't have one of us look at every one of these. So these maps really help us answer the first round of questions, and then we can put our energy into the deep red areas, for instance. But what it comes down to is planning and mitigation is really important. And now what's really important at this point is to think we're already halfway through everything that is important about the program, and we haven't even gotten to what all the paleontologists want to do, which is collect. Haven't even issued a permit yet. We're still planning, we're still mitigation. Now we talk about collection. And two sides of the coin, you can't collect without talking about curation. The fossils collected under permit remain property of the federal government, and therefore we need to talk about where the fossils are going to go, i.e. the museum. So, and paleontology is really centered on collection. That's what we do, is collect fossils. So where are those fossils going to go? And that becomes part of it. So any legal authorities we have to manage paleontology in the U.S. really are going to have to talk about collecting, permitting. Not the case in some other countries, but here in the U.S. that's super important. We need to talk about this, and certainly we do. We have authorizations under actually multiple authorities to collect and issue permits. It's that important. And then we talk about the other side of that coin, which is curation. And when fossils are collected for scientific purposes, they need to be curated. They need to be held, what we say, in perpetuity, or at least available to science. And when scientific research is done on them, they need to be held so that we can do reproducible research in the future, find out if what Dr. Wonderful discovered 20 years ago still applies today. And so curation is incredibly important. And does anyone know how many curation facilities for paleontology the Bureau of Land Management manages? We're talking curation facilities. It's kind of a trick question. It's a number slightly smaller than 1. 0. So where are all of these fossils going? Well, they're going to our partners. And today we were at the Smithsonian just down the street, but we have partners. The Bureau of Land Management has 176 repositories that hold, that curate collections from BLM that we've identified. There's more out there. And department-wide, I think the number is closer to like 900 facilities that hold collections. And many of those are Park Service facilities, federal facilities, and so on, but not all. Most of them are not. They're non-federal, colleges, universities, professional museums. We can't do this without our partners because we're not maintaining the museums. Our partners are holding these objects for us now. So that's a huge part of the program here. But that just gets us 6 ways through the program. We get to the last 2, and I really push this as a couplet as education and protection. And remember, prior to 1999, every single request for managing paleontology centered around protecting these fossils. And even the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology testified to Congress in 1994 for this paleontology law, and the testimony was all about protecting resources. And when the National Park Service talked to Congress, and I'm going to say it was around 2008, it was about a year before the law passed, testified to Congress. Again, it was about protecting these important fossils. It has become, at that point, had become the mantra. We need to protect these fossils. And now I'm coming 10 years after that saying, yeah, protection is important, and it's number 8 on our list of 8 important things we need to be doing. It's still very important, but education, I think, is the front side of that coin. And I'll show you why I think that is. Education is so important, and if we really want to take a step back, if we're not doing education about these great paleontology resources, why are we doing anything at all? What is the point if we're not telling people about what's out there? These are important resources that tell us many important things. Yes, they're important to science. They're telling us about the history of life on Earth. And if you want to understand about global climate change over the past 100 million years, 200 million years, don't ask a meteorologist, ask a paleontologist. This is what we work with. This is what these fossils are telling us about. Look at this inland sea here that was found in Indiana. This is Indiana limestone. And look at all the fossil hash in the Indiana limestone, great shell right there in the middle. Those are that's actually a photograph of some, the executive committee of the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology was just really excited to discover these fossils. Has anyone figured out yet where these fossils are? Yeah, Tracy knows. This is 7 stories above me right now. This building is made out of Indiana limestone. It is packed full of fossils. This is the roof of main interior, and you can see the post office building in the background of that photo. So education is so important. Why aren't we telling people about this? Why wouldn't we tell people about this? This is pretty neat stuff. And if we're not, there's really no point. Why would you manage fossils at all if you didn't tell people about it? And not only the coolness factor, because everyone loves to see another dinosaur, right? Who doesn't like to see a dinosaur? Come on, this is neat. This came off of public lands. This is pretty neat. But beyond the wow factor and the neat factor, and up until 100 years ago, was pretty much all we were collecting were skulls. But now we're collecting that hash, because it's that hash that tells us about what the climate was like, 140 million years ago, or in this case, it's a lot further, 300 million years ago. Really important stuff, and we want to understand these things. Education, so important. Now, protection is also very important. I don't mean to pick on law enforcement. Why do we want to protect these all the time? I view protection, I'm so happy this is the Paleontological Resources Preservation Act and not the Protection Act, like Archaeological Resource Protection Act. I'm glad we're not using the word protection. To me, the word protection invokes offense. We're going to protect it. Or the guy with the gun there, we're going to protect it. We do need to protect fossils, but that shouldn't be the first thing we want to do. The first thing we want to do is get them out of the ground, learn about them, and show them to people. Isn't this neat? Protect them, preserve them. And so, yes, law enforcement will always be important, but I think if we're doing a good job at outreach education, I think law enforcement is going to become secondary to that, ideally. And this is a photo I took 2 weeks ago that I loved it when I saw this photo because I'd just written this talk, and I was like, whoa, this covers it right here. I love it. This is education and protection. And the reason this is education and protection, this is on a Bureau of Reclamation site, a Dinosaur Trail on Bureau of Reclamation site. And how many law enforcement officers do you think Reclamation has devoted to this Dinosaur Trail? I'll just be rhetorical. I don't think many. And yet this trail is fantastic. It's wonderful. People know about it. They go there. The local college sends people to it all the time. It's popular. And the first thing you see there is, please do not deface the rocks or litter the trail. It's a very direct message. Protect this. It's a protection message, but it's also kind of positive. It's not like we're going to arrest you or we put a fence around it. It's just, hey, take care of this. This is yours. And sure enough, you go up the trail and people are policing each other. People are looking at each other like, let's take care of this. It's kind of neat. Isn't this neat? You don't see people rolling rocks down the hill or causing trouble there. This is a site that has been there for many, many years, has very, very little Reclamation doesn't spend a lot of time or money taking care of it, and yet it looks really good. People have taken care of it. It's near a visitor use area. A lot of people go there, and it's in very good condition. Trash can at the bottom is full, but there's no trash on the trail. Something that works. So I wanted to call that out and call it out one more on Bureau of Reclamation. If you go to the Casper Chamber of Commerce site or the Visit Casper site, it's advertising a Bureau of Reclamation dinosaur trail that's half an hour out of town. I mean, how cool is that? I mean, Casper's the second largest city in Wyoming. It's like, and they're proud of their dinosaur trail. I think this is a real success in partnership with a minimum of effort, I think. And it's the kind of thing we can be looking for how these things work. So just to recap on that, the map to managing paleontology is your mission, it's your authorities, it's your program. The program in turn has 4 couplets: the inventory and monitoring, because you can't manage it if you don't know what you have. The planning and mitigation, let's understand the ethics behind it and what other values there are on the land. It's not just about paleontology. And then collecting and curation, you really can't have one without the other. It's not much to curate if you're not collecting, and if you collect it, you better have a place to put it. And then education and protection, and I'd say if you're doing a good job with education, protection becomes a second, an afterthought. Occasionally you're going to need to protect it, but I don't think we should be thinking, how are we going to protect it? I think we should be thinking about, how are we going to manage it? How are we going to do all of this? And of course, protection falls in as part of that. And so having this behind us and understanding this, and it's a rational way of viewing how we're going to manage something, but when you look at it, different things, and we go to our neighbors to the north, in Alberta, they have what's called the Historical Resources Act, about 1980, and it has different authorities than what we have here in the States, and they manage their fossils differently than we do. It reserves paleontological resources for the Crown on all lands, not just federal lands, or it does all paleontological resources are reserved for the Crown. It allows the minister to dispose of paleontological resources. Now that's a big, what does that mean? There's a lot of leeway in that. And it authorizes permits and museum collections similar to what we do, and it also calls for outreach and education. So the way they've implemented their law since 1980, some ways very complementary to what we do, in other ways very different, but their emphasis is very different. Notice we don't see a big emphasis on law enforcement in Canada. We're seeing a more of an emphasis on how they're going to dispose of paleontological resources. So the only show in town in Alberta, really, and not entirely true, but the main show is the Royal Trail Museum. And it is run by the province, and they have a resource manager who is in charge of paleontology resource management for Alberta. So they have one. And Alberta's a big province. They have one person in charge of that. Of course, it works with many, many, many other people and many other industries. So they work very closely with industry, and it's collaboration with industry that the Royal Trail Museum actually has a large exhibit they call Grounds for Discovery. And in the centerpiece of that exhibit is this nodosaur here, which is an armored dinosaur, similar like ankylosaur, that kind of thing. And you really have to see this. You really have to see this in person to truly appreciate this fossil. But I don't think it would be hyperbolic to say it's one of the most amazing fossils ever. Preserves. What am I trying to say? It's a mummified, so it preserves skin. It preserves not really soft parts, but impressions from soft parts, like the heart, intestines, stuff like that. It has so much detail. It's like this animal died maybe 100 years ago and just dried out. I mean, that is amazing. This is a 110 million year old dinosaur. Was discovered by a backhoe operator on a mine in northern Alberta in the oil sands. So they're mining oil sands, and they find this fossil, and they didn't recognize what it was. They said, this is different. I think it might be one of them fossils. Let's check it out. And they took it seriously, and of course, that operator is just like, he's actually pretty famous at the moment. This fossil is really, really important. It's really incredible. And so something was working in Alberta when they discovered this. Looking over there at the fossil on the left there, it's an ammonite. We call it ammonite. And what's happening here is there are many, many of these ammonite fossils are found, but they're beautiful, beautiful iridescent coloring. And in that case too, remember, they belong to the Crown. Well, but they also have the authority to dispose of them. They collect these and sell them. And most of them are broken up into pieces, and those little pieces get polished up and made nice into jewelry, and you see them in earrings and bolo ties and handles of pocket knives. And it's considered a semi-precious gem called ammonite, from an ammonite. But the nicest specimens go to the Royal Tyrrell Museum. That is the agreement they have. And so the Royal Tyrrell Museum has a world-class collection of these amazing iridescent ammonites, but many of the fossils, the rest of the fossils, get sold and are gone. Not the way we would do it, but it's the way they're doing it, and it's working for them. But what's important is to look at what they're doing, how it's different, and what they're putting their importance on. They're following the same 8 principles of the program that I'm talking about, but they're emphasizing different things. So this gets important when we talk about Mongolia. So many of you heard about the Tarbosaurus, and we called it Tarbosaurus. Now it's called Tyrannosaurus. It's big dinosaur from Mongolia, stolen from Mongolia, brought to the U.S., sold. Big sale of Mongolian fossils was going on for many years, probably from around 1990 until around 2010. So for about 20 years, fossils were being smuggled out of Mongolia, because since 1924 it's been illegal to export fossils from Mongolia. But it wasn't illegal to possess those fossils once you got out of Mongolia, and so there's this world trade in Mongolian fossils. Similar things going on in China and many other countries right now. But in the case of Mongolia, a full Tarbosaurus went up for auction, and the president of Mongolia said enough and asked the Justice Department in the U.S. to step in and stop them. And initially the Justice Department said, well, they're not breaking our laws, but it's not something we can do. But many people got involved, and there were other issues. And I guess if you want the specifics, we have this book just out, just in 2018, just recently. This book came out, The Dinosaur Artist. It's a fascinating book. I'm not done with it yet. I'm still working on it. But it's a fascinating book. It follows this whole case of this Tarbosaurus from Mongolia. And what's important about that is that in this, the story is just this fantastic story that goes beyond paleontology. It's just this international intrigue of how this dinosaur gets around the world, and it's not a dinosaur, it's just a geological resource or some rocks of minimal value, and then they things like that. But what's important here is that not only was this Tarbosaurus recovered and returned to Mongolia, and the president of Mongolia is asking for this. This became an international incident. Then we have another 18 dinosaur skeletons repatriated back to Mongolia, and then there were more after this. At the time I talked to them, there were around 33 dinosaur skeletons repatriated to Mongolia. And we hear about this, the case closed, they repatriated them back to Mongolia. Now, enter Mongolia. How many paleontology resource managers do you think Mongolia has? Somewhere, the number is close to 1. And she was a friend of the president. So her question to us was, we need a law. We have our dinosaurs back, but now what do we do? It's not just where do we store them or how do we show them to people, but we need an authority. They have a mission. They want to protect their fossils, and they want to tell people about their fossils. So education and protection is a good start. But my first question to them then is, okay, you have a mission. What's your authority? And what kind of laws do you think Mongolia has to study paleontological resources. Well, they have this one here says, well, we can't export them from the country. Okay, there's a start. What else do you have? And so they said, well, maybe we can model something off the Paleontological Resources Preservation Act that you have. And after looking at it, our solution was, and here's an interesting solution here. Oh, we're in the wrong direction. Why don't you check out what Alberta's doing? So our recommendation to Mongolia was Alberta has a model and a system of government that is more analogous to your problem, and therefore their solution might be a little bit more analogous. Jumping into a full-fledged PRPA, Paleontological Resources Preservation Act, might not fly in Mongolia right now, and would not. And in fact, the government has changed since our meetings there, and the politics have changed very much. So another big lesson from this is that the story's not over when the repatriation is done. Like, they're just getting started now. They have a real problem. Now they've recovered the dinosaurs, but there's a whole new government in place and a whole new bunch of people looking at them going, I wonder what we should do with these. And it's kind of scary. You know, what could happen in the future with that. So Mongolia is a big case. And I want to talk about China briefly, because interesting things about China has the same problems with its been illegal to excavate fossils in China and for them to leave China since 1930. Patchwork of laws across China, and they are, quote, antiquities laws. So a colleague of ours, Jeff Liston, he was a vice president of the European Association of Vertebrate Paleontology, EAVP, has worked a lot with China and has a very, I think, important paper on the topic where the two quotes from that paper. One is that they're using laws that are applied to archaeological and art objects, and this leads to problems, as you might be able to imagine. One of the problems he ran into was that the definition of an antiquity in China, or what we call an antiquity. An analogous definition in China of an antiquity would be an important object, so and so on, important historical object that has been handled by humans. In other words, natural history objects are antiquities, but they can't be an antiquity until a human has discovered it. It's like, hello? But that's the paradigm where they're coming from, and so you can't protect fossils until somebody has actually touched it. And this is, in one case, one interpretation. Across China, the interpretations get very different from that. Very, very complex. So right now in China, there is number one is, what is the mission? And they do actually have a pretty good mission in China, and the mission is to discover, do science, preserve, and they're doing really good education in these parks. Mostly they're thinking like tourism. People want to come see our dinosaurs, and it's true, people do, and there are just some amazing things there. But what are the authorities in China? And they are different by province, they are different all across the way, and I think it's safe to say that there's really no one person who has it has a complete grasp on what's happening in China. But here in the U.S., we do have some ethical issues or questions to ask ourselves. These dinosaur eggs on the bottom, 20 years ago, or about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, you could find them in corner gift shops. Eggs, dinosaur eggs from China. And you're talking a couple $1,000s. How did they get here? If they're really from China, isn't it illegal? That's interesting. Now, there is a way around it, and that's casts. So are the casts legal? Well, here in the U.S., they're legal, but is that legal? Depends on the authority. What do we know? And we can't overlook that China has some of the most amazing fossils. So we're talking about a 500 million year old bug. Look at the detail in that. I mean, just look at the detail, and that thing is 500 million years old. It's just unbelievable, the quality of preservation, the important things. And then let's talk about birds. Let's talk about dinosaurs with feathers. Where are those coming from? China. Just some amazing, amazing stuff there. So we've talked to colleagues there about the same thing. And again, we're talking about, what is your mission? What do you want to be doing? What authorities are in place? Because your program has to wrap around those things. You can't do what Alberta's doing. You can't do what Mongolia is doing. You have to do what you're doing. based on what your authorities are, and of course your mission. And we could go on all day, every other country in the world and where they are and what they're doing. Our discussions have mostly been there, and with many, many European countries, which I'm not going to get into right here, but many European countries do or don't have fossil preservation laws. And in Canada, it goes by province. So each province has its own laws and their own interpretation of those laws, so it changes by each one. I did talk about Alberta because they're one of the more progressive ones. So it crosses all over the place, but the one consistent factor to all of these is that the mission, the authority, the programmer, this map is a rational system for managing paleontological resources that may be applied to any state, province, crown, lands. It works.